There are repeated metaphorical references that were odd as we went through it, and one of the things we discovered was that Jesus, as many scholars have, is that Jesus himself suggests his own person as the replacement for the temple that is soon to be destroyed. He at one point says, when he looks at the temple, destroy this temple and I will build another one in 3 days.
And his disciples question, how could you possibly do this?
They don't understand the prophecy at all, because of course in their time it would either be miraculous as a prediction of the temple's destruction or a miraculous construction. Obviously the temple that Jesus is referring to is a metaphorical one. No new temple was physically rebuilt. And so the temple he's talking about is the construction of a new religion. And even Paul refers to Jesus as the cornerstone of our new church. Curiously, the construction of this new temple would require the destruction of the old temple, precisely what the Romans did. In this way, Jesus is symbolically insisting that a new teaching, a new religion would have to be constructed in effect on the ruins of older Judaism.
And the temple would no longer be necessary from that point forward.
Many rebel leaders of the first century had thought that the existing temple structure had sold out to the Romans. And so we even see it reflected in the ideology in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A new temple, a more pure worship would be needed, according to many of these Jewish rebels, not to open it up to be a house of prayer to all nations, as Jesus says, but a new, purer, more orthodox temple would be required. So it's not unexpected that we find among Jewish rebels, militant rebels, of whom Simon Peter is probably just a reflection, would regard themselves as parts of a new temple, a purer temple, more in line with Orthodox Judaism and nationalist Judaism.
Scholars have noted the use of construction metaphors throughout the New Testament, referring to this symbolic reconstruction of the temple. The original Greek word describing what Jesus and his Father did for a living is the word tekton, which is usually translated as carpenter.
All of these construction metaphors predate Paul and Jesus. Indeed, Jesus' anticipation of the destruction of the temple appears to be written after the event and in hindsight. But even before the destruction of the temple, Christian leaders, probably Messianic rebel leaders, were thought of in terms of being pillars of their community or cornerstones of their religion. The name Peter himself means rock, and Jesus himself, when changing the name of Peter or Simon into the name Peter, is saying, "You will be the rock, the foundation upon which I will build my new church."
In fact, all around the Mediterranean was a network of, it would be multiple, they were loosely connected, of brotherhoods they're well established. There's actually industry going on, a variety of industries. And one of the most obvious of these brotherhood networks that had to do with real life was the cult of Mithraism. It had to do with undertaking, it had to do with burial. This was burial guild. If you were involved in undertaking and mortuary work, and heck, if you were in Egypt, that was like incredibly important, then at a certain era, you were probably going to be initiated into Mithraism. And so now we find that that's the case with the Carpenter Guild. And we find that, and unquestionably, the Masons had this kind of guild going. There are many characteristics of Christianity that are clearly from pagan precedents and pre-Christian gods and goddesses, including, very obviously and very easily proved, the notion of a virgin birth. So this idea is, in fact, fairly common to pre-Christian religion and tradition and legend. So that certainly is not original. And in fact, we find out it has an astrotheological meaning having to do with the moon, with the constellation of Virgo, and with the dawn. And that's the dawn goddess was a really great recurring theme of every day the virginal dawn would give birth to the sun god, S-U-N. And so that's why that motif is quite common. And we find Isis, who gives birth to the sun, Horus, the baby sun. We find her being called a great virgin in the 13th century before the Common Era. So anyway, so that's one motif. There are other aspects of Christian mythology, the gospel story, that we can find in other cultures as well. For example, the resurrecting of people from the dead was kind of a common theme too with other gods. They were healing gods, or gods themselves resurrecting from the dead. In pre-Christian text of Diodorus Siculus, we find the Egyptian god Horus is killed and raised from the dead, and the very word used to describe what Isis does, Isis resurrects her son Horus. The very word in Greek that Diodorus uses, anastasis, is also used in the New Testament to describe Christ's resurrection. So, and in fact, the anastasis of Jesus or the anastasis of Christ is very well known in Christian literature.
One of the curious facts that is true about Judaism even into this day is that most Jews do not believe in an afterlife. Most Jews do not have resurrection as an essential part of their religion. Now, it is true that we're told that in the first century there were certain Jewish sects, although certainly not all of them, who believed in a form of resurrection or reincarnation, but it was not universally held by Jews at the time. Scholars like Bart Ehrman, for example, have indicated that previous Judaism didn't have, and previous Christianity may not have had a concept of the afterlife that was stressed. In contrast to that, pagan philosophy, Greco-Roman philosophy, regularly featured hopes of a greater afterlife through these pagan deities, through these mystery cults. It was in the worship of these Serapis gods, these Asclepius gods, these Osiris gods, that would, or the entire class of what was called Orphic mystery cults, would really be ways for pagans to obtain a better afterlife, at least hopes of a better afterlife. This was something common throughout pagan religion at the time of Christianity, and the very form that Christianity uniquely would take, even though in many ways it's alien to traditional Judaism. The parallels between what are called pagan mystery cults, because these cults involved the learning of a secret knowledge, a gnosis, by the devotees that would be revealed only to these devotees, that would give them hopes of a better afterlife. Paul himself calls Christianity a mystery, connecting it to mystery religions. He himself emphasizes the afterlife salvation effect that Christ Jesus brings to us. Jesus, of course, himself refers to his own religion in terms of a mystery, at one point explaining to his disciples that he teaches others in parables through allegory, but in private he teaches the disciples the real deal, the inner mysteries. Although it is true that Persian, then known as Parthian religion of Zoroastrianism, which was very astrologically based, had an influence on Judaism even early on. We'll find zodiac symbols in synagogues, most curiously. Nonetheless, it is still remarkable that in the Gospel of Matthew's nativity story, of course, foreign Zoroastrian magi are specifically referred to as identifying the birth of Jesus as the Jewish Messiah through their observations of the stars. It is the famous Star of Bethlehem that leads them allegedly to the exact spot where Jesus is to be found within Bethlehem. The use of Zoroastrian religion and priests would have been offensive to Jews at the time, whatever influence astrology had already been having on the Jewish religion. For Christianity to specifically invoke the authority of these alien foreign priests, the Magi, is a startling pagan introduction into the Gospels, among many.
And of course, in Zoroastrianism, Mithras is born on December 25th in a manger and visited by magi. So that's another parallel.
Platonism was already beginning to have a profound influence on Judaism, as we discovered. In reading the works of Philo, for example, the first century Jewish philosopher, we can see many Platonic ideas being integrated with Jewish religion very carefully. On the other hand, Christianity, again, takes this pagan influence to an entirely new level. There's no question, and many scholars have noted, that Jesus is in effect reflecting a Platonic philosophy. For example, when Jesus admonishes his disciples not to store up their treasures here on earth where they can decay, but to store them up in the kingdom of heaven where they're imperishable, it's clearly a reflection of this Platonic dualism between the crude material order and the higher spiritual order. And that's just one example. Again and again throughout Jesus' teachings, it's clear he's reflecting the philosophy of Plato as much as he's reflecting anything from Jewish tradition.